Morning team, Macho Models here. It is Thursday and I just got done doing some sanding work. So let me give you a tour. So the X-29, this is not the most exciting or sexy part of building, but it is a very important one and a foundation for when you're doing a lot of your work. So I've been getting after the seam lines across the body mostly, and then also along the engine intake covers. So my process is pretty simple there. I use, number one, so I'll join the two halves together, and I've been using a lot of Plastic Magic, thanks to Child of Mecca for that recommendation. And after before I join the body, I should say, I'll go ahead and dab bits of it in there, and then I'll join the body together to get it to kind of squeeze and come through. And then on areas where I see that there's gaps, I'll come back and try to use the capillary magic or capillary action of the Plastic Magic to go back in and try to get some of that glue to come through. The next part is I usually try to use my Cereber, my ceramic knife, and thanks to who helped me out with this? I think Shane and James and all them were hype on this about a year ago, and I know some other folks have picked that up. And then I'll go and I'll pull and I'll shave. And this does a really good job. I like this better than my knife at first because the knife can do a bunch of damage. The Cereber seems to be a little bit gentler on the plastic, so I think this is a pretty good starting point. My second stage is if there's still some kind of like small little bits and bobbles there, I'll go back and then I'll use my Ulfa hobby knife. And again, Tim, Child of Mecca, all thing knower of all hobby, pointed out the blade on this is a little bit shorter, which gives you a little bit more leverage when you're trying to go in, and also I think it gives you a little bit more control versus I think a number 11 X-Acto knives. So I'll shave all that stuff off, and then actually this sanding sponge that the X-29 is hanging out on has been really cool. So I picked this up at Hobbyworks. It's about 180 grit, but I really like this, number one, for the feel and the size, so I can kind of have my whole hand on this versus if I'm using, a tiny little sanding sponge. The control on here can be a little bit more tricky, and I find my hand gets tired. This one, my hand can kind of hang out. I can be relaxed. So I've been using this a lot for most of the coverage on the X-29, which has worked out really, really well. And then I'll go back in for any areas that the giant sanding sponge can't pick up, and I'll use my smaller sanding sponge. And for now, I've actually just been pretty good with 180 and 600. In the past, I probably used 400, and then over here in the corner is this is a 60 grit sponge. I've used a more abrasive grit on here because I've gotten I should say in the past I would have used a more abrasive grit because I would be a little bit more impatient with my application. I just wanted to see that seam line go away. So I've been kind of hanging out, just listening to the radio, sipping coffee and taking my time with the finer grit, and it's worked out well. It's very hard to see on white plastic, but there isn't as much marring, so I think I've done a pretty good job of setting a base. So I did I think an okay job of filling in most of the seam lines what I could saw. Then part, I guess 3 or 4, I don't know where we're at in the process, somebody can tell me, I'll go and I'll use my Mr. Surfacer 500. And what I do here is I just mix it with where's my little drink mixer? Hanging out over here by the spray booth. So I'll mix this up, get a consistent blend out of it. The reason I use this is that I don't want to affect the threads on the Mr. Surfacer 500. Like, this is going to be with me for a long time, so every time I open it and shake it, it would spill, stuff inside the thread. So just by unscrewing it gently and then using my blender, I can kind of extend the shelf life on this. So I'll take that, and then I have my Mr. Color leveling thinner. I just put a little dab of that in there, and then I'll wet my brush and I'll use in here. One note about my brushes, I realize that I'm using these really nice Princeton Velvet Touch brushes to brush on Mr. Surfacer 500. So if I have time this weekend, I'll try to go to the hobby shop and get some trashier brushes to be able to spread this on. These are really good brushes. Like, I can probably get a number of years out of them. I take good care, and taking good care means not using Mr. Surfacer 500 on these nice brushes. So I'll go back in and I'll kind of sparingly put layers on areas that I can visually see the seam still existing. So you'll notice back here towards the vertical stabilizer or horizontal stabilizer, right, vertical up and down, thank you. I'll fill this area in. I also went behind the cockpit and then went along the engine intakes too, and then on the bottom side. And another big piece here is, in past, I would just either hit this with a hair dryer and then get after it right away. But I'm going to let this set for a little bit. I found kind of mixed results on that, but I think overwhelmingly the consensus says to wait a day or so for the Mr. Surfacer 500 to dry. I also put a little bit of the Bob Smith Industries super glue on some areas where there's a really, really deep gouge to kind of get it set. Sorry about that. For those of you guys who know, there's a 6:30 timer on my light, so that's why everything cut out there for a second. So, closing thoughts on the X-29, especially with the sanding phase. Again, it's not the most sexy or exciting part, but it is an important piece to kind of setting a good foundation for your build. And I'm enjoying myself. I'm just taking my time, and I'm happy with the results so far. So we'll see after I'm able to kind of pull this layer back and see what the seam lines are like, and then after I put a coat of white primer down, how everything turns out. So I hope you guys dig the X-29 update, and I'll pause and I'll come back here and I'll show you guys some upcoming Gundam stuff. Okay, so part 2 of the build vlog. We have some Gundams finally. So after getting after these other couple non-Gundam builds, I'm ready to come back into this as soon as the X-29 is finished. So this is kind of the trappings of the diode that I want to do for my next build. I'm not going to use all 4, but I'm actually going to use 3 of these kits, and maybe I'll kind of keep the veil covered a little bit to keep you guys in suspense as to what that's all about. But for some of you guys have heard or had picked up on me mentioning, I'm trying to go for a non-Gundam look. So I want to paint one of these in UN colors and then the other 2 in US colors. And I'm starting to shop around and pick up other kind of tools and accessories that I need for this build. So namely, I picked up some 1/144 stuff, this X-29 stuff. I was searching for figures and I couldn't find any Vietnam era figures, but I did find World War II Modern Americans Desert, and I got these on eBay for something like $6. And actually, I should note, as it turns out, this says World War II Modern Americans Desert. Every one of these that you pick up, if it's World War I or modern or Vietnam, they're all the same figures. They're just repainted. So I kind of like the look and the feel of this, and I think these guys are going to add a little bit of a cool depth to this. And if you'll notice, they do scale to 1/144th, so that's pretty keen. They are really, really small, but that's okay. And then this is really rad. I picked this up from eBay as well. These are out of England. So this is a Vietnam era vehicle. It is a M113, which is an armored troop carrier. So in Vietnam, there wasn't like a ton of armor there because of the adverse fighting conditions, especially in the jungle and whatnot. So they used a lot of these lighter weight APCs. And this is a resin cast out of England, and it looks beautiful. It's a really, really nice build. And I got this, I don't know, it was for something like $6 or $7, and then I ordered it on eBay maybe last week on Thursday, and it got here in a week. So this is cool. And you'll notice on this one, there's some bags, and there's also a 50 cal on top. And then on the other one, just for some kind of visual distinction, I picked up this one. It's a little bit smoother of a top. So I'm looking forward to painting these up. I'll also, I'm trying to work more into hand painting. And so for this, I can only airbrush so much, and I'm gonna have to go to using my hand paint or hand painted details and some washes to really bring out some color on this. So this is the crew for the Gundam build, and I'm looking forward to getting after this, especially for some of the last more complicated builds that I've done. I think this will be relatively straightforward. Obviously, that's famous last words for most hobbyists and most modelers. But I have a plan in mind. I'm going to go to the hobby shop this weekend, like I mentioned, and try to get some brushes. And then I also want to get some diorama bases for this so I can kind of visually spec out, what the layout's going to be. And I'm going to try to work on this in tandem with the X-29, since there's a lot of kind of weighting and sanding involved here. I can maybe mix things up. And then last but not least, for my mail call, I also picked up some Bob Smith Industries. So I heard that they made a 2-part epoxy, which is awesome. So in the past, I've used JB Weld, which is fine, but Bob Smith Industries, man, I'm not like I'd like to think that I'm not like a super brand dude, but Bob Smith Industries makes a fantastic product. So I'm looking forward to playing around with this. The recent mix of JB Weld I actually got the one that's gray. So for working for hobby stuff, it's probably not going to matter because most of the time we put paint over top of it, but I just wanted to give these guys a try, and I think this was something like $11, and this bottle should last me for years and years. So just a kind of a fun plug there for Bob Smith Industries, and I'm curious what kind of glues you guys use. Okay, that's it for the build vlog. I hope you guys enjoyed this little two-part series on the X-29 and the Nam Gundam builds that I'm doing. And before I close out, just want to say thanks to everybody who's been leaving comments and following along on YouTube. All that stuff really keeps me going, and I really appreciate the feedback. Some of y'all have reached back and said, hey, you know, you could probably do this better, or I like this part of the content, and this other part of the content I didn't like so much. So I really appreciate that two-way feedback. And of course, whatever you guys are working on, be sure you make it macho.